Hello, welcome to the episode of Flying High with Flutter. This is your host, Alan Wyma. Today we have two very special guests, and we're going to bring up the three-camera view so that way we can give equal time to everybody. So we have Maggie Engler,
Okay.
and we have Numa Dhamani. So both of you have come together to work on intro to GenAI. I'm not sure of GenAI, but I think it's pronounced Generative AI. Second edition. Did both of you write the first edition, or am I
We
wrong?
did.
You did, okay. Because sometimes
Yes.
people move on and somebody else writes a second edition. Why a second edition? Has there been a lot of changes since the first edition?
Yes, actually, many. One of the things that we wanted to do with the second edition was update the readers to the current state of the field, which is obviously very hard to do because if you've been following generative AI or even been using AI tools, you've probably noticed that they have increased quite substantially in capabilities over the past year. And we decided we were approached by our editor who thought that the time might be right to add new content related to some of the more recent developments in generative AI. And so that was what we sought out to do, really to update the material, make sure everything's refreshed and relevant, and add some of the exciting new stuff, which I don't know if Numa, you want to outline.
Yeah, so the second edition, we actually have two brand new chapters. We've got a chapter on prompt engineering, where we talk about strategies for writing more effective prompts. We also have one on AI agents, which I know has kind of been the big new thing this year. So we kind of explore how they're built, where they're going. We also covered things like retrieval augmented generation, multimodal models, reasoning capabilities, mixture of expert systems. So all of these things that we had maybe kind of very briefly touched on in the first edition, we go into a lot more detail. And then, of course, I think one of the things that sets our book apart from the other Manning books is that we actually go into a lot about policy, regulation, industry use, like discussions around things like data governance, licensing, creators' rights. So we go into a lot more detail about all of that as well.
Well, before we get more into that, I'd like to get some more background about each of you. Again, with two guests, it's hard for me to say who wants to be the first victim. I guess I could ask.
I can go first, but so you'd like us to introduce ourselves?
Yeah, exactly. So here's yeah, because we have two authors, right? And both of you, I believe, probably come from some pretty diverse backgrounds. So would you like to kind of talk about your career and how you got to where you are today, and especially about how you guys came together to write the first and second edition?
Sure, absolutely. I would say actually Numa and I have fairly similar backgrounds, but I'm happy to start with my own. I did my bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering with a focus on statistical signal processing. So I was doing kind of stats essentially very early on and working in data science. I started my career in cybersecurity, so building machine learning systems for various applications within that field, malware detection, fraud detection, anomaly detection for logins, things like that. And then around, 2018 maybe, I switched into what is now sort of trust and safety as a broad field, which basically means how are we thinking about digital systems and not just securing them, but making them robust to different types of adversarial use and kind of a wide range of misapplications of technology. So I was at a startup where I worked with Numa on online disinformation. Then I went to Twitter to work on their health engineering team, which is basically detecting different types of policy violations on Twitter. And then for the last few years, I've been in the generative AI space. I'm currently at Microsoft AI, and I lead sort of model safety post training, and deployment safety for all of the sort of in-house Microsoft AI models, which don't worry if you're not familiar with like the term post-training, but basically my role is for models that Microsoft AI releases. I work on ensuring that when people ask it to do different things, that it actually responds in the way that we want it to and is compliant with product level policies, is taking into account sort of different legal or reputational risks, and responding in a way that's helpful to the user, but ideally also something that the company can stand behind.
So like Maggie mentioned, my background is actually really similar to Maggie's, but I studied physics, so that trained me in a lot of math, and then also to kind of think about complex systems and failure modes. And over time, a lot of that was very easy to translate from physical systems to kind of digital systems, right? So how people, algorithms, and data interact, and then what happens when those systems start to break down. So similar to Maggie, my entire career has also been in trust, safety, and security. So a lot of what I've been doing is kind of understanding how technology fails, how people exploit it, and then how we can start to design systems that can earn trust instead of eroding it. So I'm also a machine learning engineer. Right now, I'm the head of machine learning at iVerify, which is a cybersecurity startup focused on mobile threat hunting. So a lot of my work is about how people try to break our mobile infrastructure and systems, and then trying to design machine learning models that detect misuse and strengthen resilience. So Maggie and I work together at a startup, and then again also at Twitter. So we've worked together at a few places at this point. And the book kind of just came together with us having talked, I think having kind of worked in similar fields and having talked a lot about a lot of these concepts and how we can start to apply them, kind of think about this mindset in AI as well.
That's quite interesting. Do you like complement each other, or are you really exactly more similar than not alike?
I think we're pretty
really
aligned in terms of a lot of like what we wanted to say about generative AI in the book, and ways in which we wanted to meet our audience, I guess. Because we do, as Numa kind of referenced earlier, take an approach where we want to bring new people who maybe haven't done a lot of either research or aren't as informed about how these different AI systems work, but are more on the curiosity side, if you will, or maybe have started using them in their work and gotten a bit more either interested in or critical about how these AI systems are being used. So I think we're similar in that respect, but we probably are complementary in like some of our like working style. And what we did that helped a lot was kind of we'd each split up and draft certain sections and then sort of give them to the other person to read through and make sure we had at least a few perspectives on all of our existing content.
Yeah, and I do think maybe like I think we work similarly as well. Like I think we both work pretty well async and remotely and don't always need to be face to face to do a lot of that work. And maybe that's just because we understand how the other person works and thinks. But yeah, I think it's actually pretty easy to work together. And I think part of that maybe comes from us having been colleagues as well before.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm working with somebody right now that I worked with at a previous company, and it's pretty like we kind of know, how each other work, and we're kind of forgiving when it's like one person's kind of falling behind because we know that we pick it up another day or something. It's kind of interesting. But coming back to something that Maggie mentioned, and I think it's super important that I don't hear a lot of people talking about is like the data governance in terms of people having access to things that they should have access to and not have access to things that they should not have access to. But coming back to this, I find that topic to be super interesting. And now that you mentioned you're working at Microsoft, I remember seeing something particularly it's kind of related to Gen AI and data governance that was a little bit questionable. This was at least half a year ago in terms of, I believe, Office 365 has introduced some Gen AI into it. at least some AI where it's going to be reading your documents and help you to write other documents? I'm not holding you responsible for
Uh,
this, but I thought this is an interesting topic. I'm not sure if you heard about this before.
so I work on the consumer side, which is the Microsoft AI in-house models. I don't know as much about the Office 365 suite, although certainly the company has made a concerted effort to introduce a lot of AI features across Microsoft products, but I certainly don't have any inside intel around sort of the data governance on the enterprise side.
Yeah, I was just thinking like because we're talking about data governance in terms of like if you have because it all kind of relates, right? Because with Gen AI, I think you also have a section in here about this where it's like it will read previous works and then use that as kind of a base to generate new work, right? If that's my understanding about Gen AI, and so kind of a problem that some lawyers were seeing is that it was actually reading some case files and helping to generate new documents, which it shouldn't actually do because you can't like use one case with another or something when you have ongoing cases. I'm not actually going to be expert on this, but I thought this is kind of interesting about, in terms of data governance, right? How you can kind of stop this problem where you make sure you don't have things leaking across with Gen AI.
Yes, I think that more broadly, the question of data governance is definitely a active issue in generative AI because on one hand, and I'm not a lawyer, so I won't speak to like whether you can use what you can use in a given case, but um, I think one thing that we are seeing is that obviously there are a lot of people that want to share documents with generative AI assistants that they're using, and for exactly the reason that you mentioned, right? Because if I, hand over my emails, presumably that will make the model much better at emailing in my tone of voice, or understanding, oh, here's the type of writing that I'm doing. Here's the type of writing that I would like you to draft for me, let's say. So it's very beneficial in a lot of use cases to have that degree of personalization. But at the same time, one of the things that we talk about in the book is that you do need to be extremely cautious around what are the permissions for the use of that material. What is the sort of terms of use for the specific, subscription if you're using some existing model service? There are services that don't have, or that do sort of zero retention and fully private inference. But you kind of have to seek that out if that is something that is important, which obviously it is if the document or grounding information in question is confidential.
Well, I'm also curious about like with Gen AI, right? How much of it will be truly, like one of a kind versus based on somebody else's work? Is that something that's very special to the model? Because you can imagine, giving a bunch of drawings of different, let's just say mice, and he come up with something similar to looking like Mickey Mouse. That could be a big problem. So how can we help? How can we have it so that way when we generate something from Gen AI, we're not leaning too much on other people's input versus something that's truly new?
So a lot of what the model produces isn't actually literally like one of a kind, right? Because it learns from a lot of the patterns from existing human work. Um, but I think a lot of the combination of ideas and styles and structures it generates can be new. So a lot of generative models kind of, I think a way to say it would be maybe like remix a lot of the work that they have seen before. So the originality will come in the way they kind of synthesize, in a way that maybe an individual creator hasn't done, but it's always still kind of grounded in a lot of the data that they've been trained on. If that helps answer your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. Because that's something that's always come up in thoughts of mine is like how much, if I wanted to generate something that's truly interesting, I mean, at what point is it something that I can say, okay, this one we can like copy. I often use Gen AI to generate some very nice copy, and then I could say, okay, I want it more like this one, more like that. And it sounds pretty good, but I start to wonder at some point, like, will I be in trouble because maybe it's too much like one of the inputs or one of the data that it's been trained on. It's something, but it's something I really like. At what point can I put
Yeah.
myself behind it?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really great question. And we do actually touch on this a little bit in the book as well. where we talk a lot about because we talk a lot about copyright and creators' rights, and I think it's really interesting because we talk, and then also a lot, I think, about kind of human in the loop, and we kind of think of it as more of like, this is kind of first draft that you can work off of, something that you can edit or modify to your own style, format, or however you want it, versus us, here's an output that I got, this is exactly what I'm going to, send out as like a blog post or paste on LinkedIn or put it into an art show or however you are using GenAI tools. So I think to kind of answer your question, a lot of the model outputs I think you get are in a way new, right? Because they're being synthesized and combined in like different ways. But again, everything does reflect the style and structure and examples that it sees during training. So to kind of answer your question, it's kind of both, right? Like it's probably not exactly the copyrighted content, but yes, it's getting the patterns and structures that I was trained on from the copyrighted content. Maggie, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add to that.
I was just going to say, yeah, and I think that this is an extremely active sort of debate within primarily the sort of legal and regulatory community at this point, around one, how the use of training of copyrighted materials in training, and then second, to your point, the reproduction, because it is, and we make an analogy to people also have many valid scenarios in which they generate content of similar styles to existing content, or they've seen a picture that inspired them and drew something of the same style, maybe a different subject, and it's in some cases, in some senses, analogous to that. In other cases, totally a new ball game because of the scale and the or I guess scale of ingestion and the scale for the reproduction to be possible. So that's definitely something that is sort of under active debate. And we've seen, one of the other things that we talk about are kind of how are the or what possible resolutions could come as these things start to get ironed out, both in court and in public practice. So a couple of the things that we touch on are licensing agreements that we started to see model developers strike with content owners or copyright owners. Anthropic had recently paid out a huge settlement to a bunch of authors. And I think there's very real questions about, kind of like what is this individual work of maybe a single author or a single artist contributing to the model, and how do we sort of accurately give them either a piece of what the value that they produce for that company, or at least control over their creative outputs.
No, that's a good point. I didn't even think anything about kind of getting credit. I know that Reddit was kind of famous for putting a lot of their APIs under kind of lockdown because I believe one of the ChatGPT models was trained using Reddit or something, or was that DeepSeek? I forgot which one. So it's a good point. But some of this AI is getting kind of out of hand, no? Especially with the generative AI, because like now I usually, when I have a moment, I'm just flipping through like Facebook Reels, and I see some of the most craziest generative AI videos, and it drives me nuts. I feel like now we've gone into a time where it's too much. I don't know what happened. It seems like overnight, all of a sudden, almost every reel I'm watching is something that's so fake and so like ridiculous that it's like, okay, this is obviously Gen AI. I mean, are we going to get to a point where it's really just we have no idea what's real, what's not? Because right now you can kind of tell. There's some kind of telltale signs that you could see, like maybe fingers are in a weird way, or something's a little bit blurry, or the logos on products are missing. Is there going to be a way? Is there going to be a point that you think someday where we really have no idea, and it could really be so real that it's going to fool everybody? Even though right now we're still fooling people at the moment. I think some AI videos came out recently that were actually put out on the news that people thought they were real. No.
I do think we're actually very close to that point. I think a lot of AI generated text, a lot of images, a lot of video can actually pass as real without very obvious telltale signs. Um, I think the problem maybe isn't so much that it looks so real, but I think it's the volume because of the access that people have now to a lot of these models. It's very cheap to kind of create a lot of content like this. So I think the problem actually lies more so in the scale right now as opposed to kind of how good these models are. It's both, but I think the scale is a really big factor. And I think detection is improving. We are getting better at detecting stuff, but I do think it's never going to be perfect, and it's also so reactive to this problem that it's always lagging behind. So I think our future is kind of less about having kind of these perfect detection systems and more about maybe like verification systems. So maybe we need to invest more into things like provenance, digital signatures, and having kind of authenticity be part of your workflow as opposed to kind of having people like visually judge if this is real or not.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, and the analogy that I've talked about a lot in the past is already if someone tweeted something, or I guess posted on X, something in text format, that's not necessarily, you're not necessarily assuming that that's true if you see it. Like someone tweets, oh, Lady Gaga is at my apartment right now, something like that, right? You don't, unless it's sort of a trusted source, you're not going to necessarily assume that that text is legitimate or true for some definition of accuracy. And I think historically, photos and videos have been a higher standard of evidence, but that standard of evidence is going to quickly sort of, I would say, fall to where text is today, which is that you maybe have an initial reaction to some text, whether or not it's true or not, but you ultimately have to assess a lot of different factors. Like, is this plausible? Who is this coming from? Is this coming from a reliable source? And I think that's the type of sort of media literacy that we will need to apply to images and other multimedia very soon, if not already, as Numa pointed out. I think the differences, at least visible differences, are diminishing and going to probably completely disappear. Um, and then we talk in the book about some of these solutions, provenance, content credentials. But I do think that, and the verification solutions that Numa mentioned. So it will, I think, meaningfully change how people consume media. But it's not something that is totally new to us in the sense that we've had already with social media, like we are exposed to a lot of content, and there is sort of this work of sifting or like systems that we can also develop to essentially assess what we or like kind of levels of probability of trust in that type of content. So, but I agree, it's definitely a big issue, and I think one of the things we've gotten a lot further on watermarking, for example, like making that possible and making that more robust to manipulation. But similar to cybersecurity, where Numa and I have both spent years, it's the kind of thing where once you build some kind of system for like, okay, this is successful against all these different types of changes to my video, and I can still tell that it's like AI generated by my system. The people that are invested in beating that defense are also consistently innovating. So it's going to be, I think, probably a cat and mouse sort of situation for many years.
Can you talk a bit more about the digital verification? Because I'm kind of curious about how that could work. Is it some kind of embedding of some metadata that people can somehow verify, like a what do you call it, like a PGP kind of key thing, or what are you thinking about?
There's a few different solutions already that exist. So one of them is metadata based, or like a few of them are metadata based. So as you mentioned, kind of essentially a cryptographic signature in metadata that you can add. The obvious, I guess, downside is that if you imagine an image, for example, like I can just take a screenshot of the image and now my metadata is all new metadata. Uh, so really like the more robust intervention would be at the data level itself. And an example of this, like Google has a tool called SynthID, but I think that's probably that's the one we talked about. I would say the most in the book in terms of the data level, and is probably the most robust that I'm aware of to a lot of different changes. But that is more akin to if you've seen people kind of like add noise to photographs without changing the like how the visual perception of the photo looks. It's more similar to that, where you're adding some type of imperceptible signal to the actual data itself, which makes it much harder to sort of one, detect, and then two, change.
Okay, I didn't even know about the synth ID. That's pretty interesting. I know definitely the metadata thing definitely makes a lot of sense to me. Um, what about people stealing keys and kind of watermarking things themselves? That's also going to be an issue. No, then you have to kind of make a new key and roll that whole thing out again, right? So there's no like way to totally make something, for sure
Yeah,
this is
I think
true or false.
there are a lot of, I think, kind of issues right now with watermarking and provenance, and I think it's why it's not something that has been adopted at scale, although we're kind of, I think, heading in that direction, right? I think a lot of with watermarking, we don't have a lot of very robust ways to kind of get around things like re-encoding, cropping, filtering. We were already seeing like attackers kind of use tools that will strip or kind of distort watermarks, and there also aren't kind of these like cross company standards, so the watermarks don't actually work across like platforms or models. And then of course with text it's even harder to watermark text reliably because a lot of those schemes can actually be detected, and then if you can detect them you can undone, you can kind of, they can be undone, right? With provenance we also have a lot of like a host of other kind of issues where it really only works if it starts with a trusted capture device. Most of it doesn't. There's no universal standard. We've got C2PA, which is promising, but the adoption is, I think, again, very slow, inconsistent. Um, a lot of apps and platforms will actually strip metadata. Provenance will break when it's like screenshotted, it's recorded, it's reshared. It's really hard to kind of implement it for text because there's no global protocol, there's no embedded metadata. So I think these are really promising directions that still need a lot of work and research, and we need to kind of figure out ways to scale and be able to adopt them kind of globally right now. I think we're kind of only seeing them at in like really small kind of niche, used in like niche ways right now.
Yeah, and I think just to add a very small point is that there are, you know, a host of technical solutions to this. In my view, the bigger challenge is adoption. I think that, and this again is sort of analogous to a few different things in cybersecurity, where we have, cryptographic protocols that, without or given the current state in quantum, like are secure and provably so. And so we're not quite there with, I think, a lot of these provenance systems. But even then, or even if we did, I think that the challenge is like how many users are really going to do this when they again see something online. Are I think news organizations can start to use these tools to avoid sort of some of the scenarios that we've outlined as risky. But in general, this kind of goes back to like the assessment of like the source sort of these new considerations in the level of trust needed to accept a given piece of content, because I think in general, like even today, even what we know of people's consumer behavior or user behavior today, like it would be a very hard ask to get people to verify like even the metadata at a scale that would make a dent in, I think, the broader information ecosystem online.
Something else just came to my mind. I was thinking about, sometimes in software you want to reverse engineer something, or you need to like replace some proprietary code with some of your own code. What if some of this code that's proprietary that you shouldn't have access to somehow gets into the model? You use GenAI and you actually start generating some code that maybe you shouldn't have. What kinds of, I mean, as a software developer, this is something I kind of worry about. Is there anything I should be like worried about when if I'm decided to actually start using Gen AI in my code to start maybe coding out some algorithms or fixing some of my code as it is?
I think we've actually seen some examples of this happening when, like, I think there were some news stories kind of maybe more earlier, when like ChatGPT came out, where some software engineers maybe put in some of kind of proprietary code, and it was potentially like leaked into the systems. And so we've kind of seen examples of that happening already. I do think that the biggest IP risk is definitely kind of training on proprietary code, not necessarily using it as a coding assistant. But of course, outputs can kind of accidentally resemble copyrighted or internal code. And I think this is why it's so important to kind of have these human in the loop systems, right? Where you are kind of treating any sort of code as like a third party dependency, where you would review it, you would test it, you would refactor it. You would probably want to, run it through any sort of like license or compliance scanners if you use them. You can, I think, a really good way to kind of use it as a pair programmer, as opposed to just having it essentially code for you. And of course, yes, I do think there is like mitigations you could take, is just to maybe, not put proprietary code into these GenAI systems.
Yeah, but in general, I mean, these things just can kind of leak out, right? I remember working at a place somewhat recently, and they were quite concerned about what models that you use, because obviously it can take that data in, or may actually tell you, hey, we actually use some of the stuff that you input and we use it to help make our models better.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
Yes.
basically
Yeah.
something
Almost
you're
all
covering right now, right? Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that, I think, is like policy and governance, right? So I think there are several like opt-out policies where you can opt out of it using your conversations for training. I think internally for organizations, you do need some policies for where you can and cannot use GenAI, what kind of data is allowed in your prompts, how to track generated code in case there are, disputes or legal matters. So I think a lot of that just kind of falls to the policy and governance point. And Maggie, I think I cut you off. So
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just going to draw the comparison to the same thing, that we discussed earlier with respect to checking the terms of use. A lot of these now, initially, and we talk about this in the first edition, because we did see a lot of, enterprise companies, big banks, things like that early on kind of block all types of generative AI systems for this reason exactly. And then now what we've seen is a lot of those same companies that had initially said, okay, no ChatGPT, this is off the table, because people are copying and pasting, our proprietary code in there. Now a lot of those same employers have started to negotiate enterprise contracts, for example, where there's explicitly no training on that data. And so it's really just ensuring that the licenses or the permissions that are required for the level of data that you're working with can be met by the model provider.
But do you think that these companies that will help you, with Gen AI, that they actually are actually honest with what they're doing with your inputs and your data? Because I mean, that's always something I worry about. It's like you say you don't, but does that actually mean that you really don't, or is it maybe some sly lingo that they're saying?
I do think if they say they're not training on your data, they're not training on your data for a host of legal and policy reasons. I would think they're not.
Yeah, it would at least be a major scandal and substantial fine. But I think, I mean, that kind of is that question can be applied to any service provider online, right?
I'm just trying to think. Didn't Facebook do some kind of stuff with some data quite a few years ago that was a huge scandal? I mean, they're kind of still around with and probably also doing other interesting things. So I still kind of I'm always weary about everything, especially if it's a large company with a lot of money like Facebook or sorry Meta or other companies I'm not going to mention because they're here. But you never really know. I just always worry what's happening. Just maybe I'm just overthinking stuff, so that it's always in my mind about is it really just this or it's always the fine print, right? Like I say, okay, we don't use it to train, but maybe we're using it to like test something. It's like, well, what does that actually mean? Like maybe there's some sly lingo in there.
And I think that's why it's really important to kind of actually go through a lot of their policies and really understand how they are using your data. And I do think we talk a lot about this in our book as well, where we do point out instances of like, here's how, company X, Y, and Z is using it, and here's ways you can opt out of it, or here are things to look out for. And I think that's why it is really important to actually understand how they're using your data. And then also kind of, if you are working at a company, have some sort of policies around how you want to handle different scenarios. And then of course, for your like personal use, you kind of know what your boundaries are.
But I do see you have a whole section about AI agents, right? It seems like that's kind of the new next hot part of AI is AI agents. Can you talk a bit more about AI agents in terms of the Gen AI and how are they kind of used?
Yeah, sure. That's definitely an area that we've seen. One of the areas that we actually explicitly added for the second edition because we've seen so much activity in that area. One of the main use cases of agents today is in programming and coding agents. So we've seen a lot of adoption of tools like Cursor, tools like Claude Code. Maybe folks have used them, and it's sort of an exciting shift because initially, again, a lot of these systems were pure sort of generation, but not necessarily integrated with any scaffolding or any other external systems. And so that means maybe, ChatGPT can spit out a function for me, for example, but I'm still going to be the one copying that into my editor and running it and so on. And now we see a lot more autonomy with the models, or powered by the models themselves. But as we've also kind of discussed and hit on in a few different places, that also is attended with a new sort of attack surface or a new risk surface, because I don't want to say attack necessarily, because I don't think it needs to be malicious in all cases. But if that model makes a mistake and has the power to do a lot of editing on my system, I could see like my file accidentally deleted, or a change that I didn't actually want to make, and then that code has already been executed, and I've now done something that actually interacts with an external system. So one of the things that we look at are or a lot of what we're looking at in the book is, one, how these agents are trained, because I think that's useful for people to understand, and then a lot of things that we discuss also are like, how are we thinking about the deployment and use of agents, and adequately sort of ensuring that there are guardrails in those systems to avoid the more catastrophic outcomes. So, for example, like if I have a coding agent or multiple companies now, I think both OpenAI and Anthropic now have computer use agents which can navigate the web for you, for example. So, what are the types of transactions then that I want that agent to make sure that it confirms with me before it does? Things like transaction or like purchasing something might be an example of that, or submitting my data on a web form might be another example where I want to make sure that that agent is going to check back in with me as its user slash supervisor. And so yeah, like I think it's a fascinating space, and we're just starting to define a lot of these product interactions for the first time.
Yeah, you brought up some memories about that the famous Repellent kind of vibe coding experiment where it went amok and basically was lying about the data and then deleted production database. I mean, I remember actually talking to somebody else about this, and he said the same thing, is that you need to actually add in these kind of permissions and stuff. Don't let it have access to do certain really destructive actions, and like you said, also double check, what it's saying. It's like trust, but definitely verify. It's a little bit scary that the computer is kind of a little bit too human-like, maybe like I said, too human like in terms of lying when things are not going so well, right? Stuff that usually, like I said, is too real. People don't exactly do that anymore. That's kind of how I'm able to kind of see some of these AI videos. It's like, this is just too, it's an uncanny valley. It's just too realistic. Something's trying a little bit too hard to be human. It can't be right.
Well, yes, it definitely hallucinates quite a bit. I actually
Yeah.
like to say that with a lot of the AI agents, we should maybe verify and then trust as opposed to trust and then verify. Um, but but yeah, one of the, I mean, of course, agents, I think Maggie did a really good job at kind of listing a lot of the risks and limitations of them, and hallucinations is definitely a really big one. And we do talk a lot about mitigations. I know Maggie mentioned a couple with kind of like humans in the loop, doing things like fallback checks where you kind of require agent to self-verify, ask for confirmation. We talk about things like, having kind of principles of like least privilege. So maybe agents only get the exact permissions that they need, or there's like 2-level constraints where you define exactly what each tool is allowed to do. A lot about like monitoring, evaluation. Um, so we can kind of avoid exactly the scenario that you were talking about. But I think we are still pretty early in the agent days of actually having kind of defined workflows. I think we're still trying to figure a lot of that out, which I think is really exciting because it's a really fun space to be in. Um, but but I do think right now there are definitely a lot of risks and limitations, and that's why we definitely need a lot of mitigations in place.
All right, we're starting to approach kind of the end of our time. I'm afraid to start a new topic and we start to run over time. But I would like to kind of let, whether it's each of you or together, or if somebody wants to volunteer, kind of like a wrap up about in terms of who this book is for and who should get it. Maybe even not. Maybe even who's it not for is also kind of a good thing to also see, to kind of rule yourself out in case you've already been part of AI for some time. Whoever would like to say.
Sure, I can start with a pitch. I think that, and I touched on this earlier, but our book, we really do want it to be for the public. There's no, and this is actually pretty unique among Manning books as well, or the books published by our publisher, is that there are not coding exercises, there are no coding sections. You're not expected to build an LLM, which there are. I think we do have offerings with that goal. So I guess that's one thing that if that's what you're looking for, more of a practical guide to building these systems, I would say this is probably not for you. But we really wanted to fill what we viewed as a gap in the case that, like, I would talk to my family members, I talk to my friends who are not in this space, and all of them are using, or a lot of them are using generative AI systems in one way or another, but don't really know or don't really recognize, and I think developers are probably more likely to recognize some of these like downsides or risks, and then don't know much about like how they're built, and can't understand necessarily why certain responses come out the way they do, and so that is our target audience, like folks who have maybe have been exposed to these systems, or even just read about like, oh, AI, I've heard everyone's been talking about this for the last couple of years. Like, what should I know? And as Numa also mentioned, like we wanted to go broad with the coverage as opposed to narrow. So we talk about not only how they're implemented, but like case studies and sort of social legal implications, the ongoing debates. So we talked about, like today, we talked about some around intellectual property, but basically, like, what is the state of AI today, and how do we see that going in the future?
I think Maggie covered a lot of who the book is for and maybe who not it's for. So I'll kind of focus on why people should read it. But I think, I guess Maggie covered a little bit of this too, but I think what we try to do is we try to bridge the gap between a lot of the technical foundations and societal impact. And we try to explain these really complex ideas and models, I think in somewhat simple terms, or we try really hard to do that. Um, and we try to give, I think, a really kind of clear and honest picture of where Gen AI is right now, what's coming next, and what still needs solving. So a lot of what we wanted to accomplish with the book is kind of cut through a lot of the hype and fear with some kind of clear explanations, some real examples, and kind of cover how both the technology works and then how it's changing society.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I do appreciate hearing both, who's it for, who's it not for. It makes it really helpful. This is definitely something I'm going to definitely be going more and more through. I want to thank each of you for coming on. Maybe we'll have you on for the third edition. Yeah. So again, we're going to have, I believe, a discount code for anybody who's interested in getting the book. Pick up the book from Manning.com, because we don't want to keep helping Jeff go back to the moon again and again and again. We want to actually kind of help out the authors a bit more. So maybe they'll make a third edition. Yeah. And with that, then again, thanks for coming on, and hopefully we'll see you guys for, again, the third edition.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Alan.
much for having us.
Yeah.